Hello, everyone. Welcome to our DevSecOps panel. I hope you're enjoying Puppetize today. We have a fantastic group of panelists, and I'm so excited to ask them a bunch of questions. So we will go ahead and get started. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to drop them into the chat window on the right or into the Q&A. You can use whichever one you'd like, and we will get right to them. So first, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves. So Alyssa, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Alyssa Miller. It's great to have you all here. So I am an application security advocate for Snyk. I'm also a hacker and a researcher. Been pretty much a hacker all my life. Bought my first computer when I was 12 years old and did some horrible things to Prodigy. But this is what I've been doing. I've been in security for the last 15 years, really with a focus on application security. I'm a former developer. And so now working for Snyk, really focused on helping organizations kind of figure out how to get the security into DevSecOps and how to deal with things like their cloud transformations and so forth as we move into more of the cloud native technologies and so forth.
Great. Jujar, you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Jujar. So I'm head of DevSecOps, DevSecOps practice lead at The Economist. And in particular, we've had in the last 2 years, we've had a particular focus on security. I know it's a cliche, but we're trying to shift security left and trying to change the culture within the organization. And we've had some good success. A few things haven't worked well, and we've learned a lot from that. So I'm keen to share.
Great. And Sonia, last but not least.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sonia Moisets. I'm a lead security engineer at Photobox. I'm also tech lead and security manager for Pride London. I'm also an advocate for women in tech.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining our panel today. I'm just going to jump right into a couple of questions. Alyssa, let's start with you. So we recently did the Secure Developer podcast together, and that was so much fun. Thank you so much for having me. And we compared data from our last State of DevOps report, which was focused on security, and your 2020 State of Open Source Security report. And I shared one of the findings about the practices that drive confidence in security posture, with the top one being threat modeling. And I know this is an area that you're very passionate about. Can you share with our audience what threat modeling is and also why it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you know, I've got a real passion for threat modeling in particular. And the simple answer to your question that I tell people more often than not is just simply, what is threat modeling? Well, threat modeling is asking the question, what could possibly go wrong? And this is actually a timely question because just this week we released the threat modeling manifesto. And so the official, if you will, definition that we came up for threat modeling is that it is analyzing representations of a system to highlight concerns about security and privacy characteristics, asking the 4 questions: what are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good enough job? And those 4 questions are what's really important with threat modeling, because if we do a threat modeling very early in the life cycle, and I advocate for doing threat modeling, honestly, at the point that you're writing your user stories and actually adding that information to the backlog, because when you have that information there, that informs the rest of your pipeline. So you think about it, you go from your backlog into sprint planning. Well, now as you start looking at those various user stories you might make a part of your sprint, you've got all that information that tells you about what you need to be thinking about as you're building the software in terms of security. So then when it comes time to actually start coding, your devs now have this information that they can follow, and they can actually build security controls as they're developing the software because they understand what the most critical pieces are. And now that information flows from your devs up into your test cycles, because now you can use that same information on the threats and then the controls that your devs have created to really guide your test cases. And so now your security test cases can be built very easily off of that. And then when it comes to deployment and those ops folks, SecOps folks in particular, who are managing, monitoring all of your have that information, they know how to configure their monitoring to watch for those most likely attacks and those specific threats that were identified. So threat modeling just gives you that very early, we talk about pushing left, and we've been talking about that probably for 2 decades now. Yeah, it gets you that very, very early, how can you push a further left than the user story? And now you have that information throughout the rest of your pipeline to make sure that security is enabled throughout.
That's fantastic. And would you mind dropping in that link to the manifesto?
Sure.
Love to see it. And Jujhar, just building on what Alyssa said, how does an organization start to build a risk mitigation strategy? And, especially if they haven't done that before, and what are some approaches that you would recommend to help people get started with this?
Sure. So I'll tell you about everything that we did wrong, and hopefully that'll tell you about the right way. What we did, there's everybody knows, all the developers, all the way up to the managers, that things aren't quite right and there are gaps. And getting to that level of honesty takes time. It takes a cultural change that everyone can accept, because first you've got to accept that it's not right in order to make the change, right, to get the investment. The mistake that we went on this path where we were going to pay someone $200K and get just pay them to do our security. So can we pay an external SOC vendor to get our security done for us, right? And that was the plan. We went through this whole big RFP process. We had 3-4 vendors come in, give us the whole pitch. Amazing platforms, right? But at the end of it, all of them, with their amazing tooling and super security people on board, and SOCs follow the sun around the world. And we send them all our data. They can analyze it and look for look for North Koreans in our network, right? All they were going to do was tell us about the existing mistakes, tell us about the existing holes in our system. We already know that there are port 22 open to the world. We already know that a lot of our GitHub repos aren't being scanned by SNCC. We already know these things. Paying someone $300,000, $200,000, $400,000, whatever the price was, to give us the feeling of security isn't going to actually make us more secure. And in fact, the noise that they would generate is only going to block us from delivering the actual value. So what we did is we pared it back and said, okay, we have this money, we have this budget. How do we get from security? And then what we did, and I'll share the link in the chat here, is we did a capability model. Where are the gaps? What we need to turn Guard Duty on. We need to turn AWS Security Hub on. We need to get all the repos into SNCC. We need to have a policy where vulnerabilities are fixed. So all the what my CISO calls basic stuff, but really hard stuff, we need to do that first. And so we need to get level 1 done first. Then we can go on to the level 2 and get the SOC super cool stuff that's going to prevent us from the sort of advanced persistent threat scenarios, that kind of thing. That journey took some time, and how we got on that journey, how we came to that sort of idea, was through the capability modeling, through reading the Accelerate, the DevOps handbook, and we realized, actually, let's map where we are and then map the journey and all the user stories we need to be able to get there. I'll share the link in the meantime.
Yeah, please do. I'm sure everyone would love to have that. And Sonia, you're doing so much in the open source space right now. Where do you think threat modeling fits there?
So I guess if I compare with the work that I've been doing for Pineline, which is an open source project, there are 2 areas that would be interesting in terms of threat modeling. So the first one would be obviously access control for the maintainers. So, for example, to have 2FA record, which is quite a baseline, but it's always good to remind on GitHub that you should record this. You can also go grouping your users, your maintainers, and give them specific permissions to access specific repositories, for example. Having also branch protection on your main branch as well, so you don't have those deleted, obviously. There's also a piece around secret management that you could do now if you have organization open on your GitHub setup. So you can have a top line secrets that could cascade to specific repositories as well. And this is where you could also apply rotation of your secrets, keys, and different credentials that you could have in open source. Because having an open source project doesn't mean that you shouldn't do access control and secret management, for example. Another one, obviously, is third-party dependencies. And there's a wide array of tools available on the GitHub Marketplace. So obviously you will find Snyk, but you will also find native integration from GitHub with dependency graph that raise issues, or having like a view visibility, but they also have Dependabot. They'll raise automatic pull requests and give you also compatibility score because they compare it with other open source projects. So if it doesn't break their CI/CD pipeline, you can actually merge those. PR will give you confidence. But there's also a lot of these tools I can like White Source Bolt, Renovate, Greenkeeper, Snyk. It's also good to have a couple of those tools so you can compare because they're tapping to different database. So it's also good to have those. And you can also start creating a small pipeline as you could find for organization by doing this for your open source project with all the tools that you could find on the GitHub Marketplace, not only for security, but also for code review, for code quality, for compliance. There's a lot of categories. I really recommend, I'll put the link on the chat to have a look and just try because it's open source, so it's free for public repositories and open source projects.
Great, thank you, Sonia. When we were talking earlier, we discussed how to get developers more invested in secure coding practices. And, I think all of you had some great examples of that kind of taking shape. And Jujhar, let's start with you. How are you seeing developers start to adopt more continuous compliance practices?
Right, let me see if I can find a book. Hold on. Right, so here we go. Lisa's favorite book, Threat Modeling, right? Right. So, and I agree with Alyssa and this is the thing that I've only adopted recently. So before I'd call security shooting from the hip, right? And we just say, you need to be more secure, right? This allows us to be granular and be targeted and specific. And we've only got limited amounts. So we've got 1 engineer, 2 engineers, but we've got 10 engineers worth of work. What things do we target first, right? Pick the higher things on the threat model and just accept the risks that are lower down, right? So recently at The Economist, we had the US 2020 election, right? And a big threat to people didn't like, I won't share the slides, but people don't like necessarily what The Economist has to say, a certain section of society about, about who should be president of the United States. We were right, so that's good sign. But how do I get developers to engage with this, right? How do we do that? So what we did is a tabletop red team exercise. So this is a way of getting our threat model, but making it more digestible and acceptable to engineers. So we did our threat model internally. So did a nice boring document first. Then we say, okay, what are the biggest threats to us? The biggest threats to us are probably not the advanced. We're not the Washington Post. We're not New York Times. So it's probably not going to be, advanced persistent threats, state-sponsored hackers or attackers for us. It's more likely going to be script kiddies who just do a DDoS attack on us, that kind of thing. They just go to one of these web stressors, $30, right? And you can 220 gigabits, you can attack someone's network for just $30, right? So it's not even hard to do. So what we did is we created some fake tweets. We tweeted that Donald Trump didn't like what The Economist had to say. Then we tweeted some fake tweets about, they look pretty real, about one of his, sort of QAnon flat earther type supporters saying that, we're going to DDoS you, and then play that threat through. So then how'd all the engineers in a hangout? Okay, what web team? Where are your threats? So if this huge amount of traffic comes to you, what's going to happen to you? And spoke about it in real time, in sort of, we couldn't do the real experiment. We spoke about it. This much traffic. What's going to happen to your application? How's the application going to behave? How's it going to scale? How's the web application firewall? And we did that exercise, and all the engineers could feel the threat. and understand the threat a bit more, rather than what we would traditionally do is hit them with a big fat ugly spreadsheet and say, oh, these are the Jira tickets you must do. And we just brought it to life by telling the story. So just doing that. So I'd really recommend that as an exercise. I can't share the slides that we created, unfortunately, but I'll see if there's some other way that I can share what we did. But that was really basically just tell the story, make it real, make it human. Right, turn this very useful methodology, but just add some color around it.
That's fantastic. Sonia, can you tell me about some of the techniques that you're using at Photobox to integrate security into the development process and just kind of bring more developers along?
Sure. So what I've been trying to do at Photobox is to find all the forums where I could tell a story related to security to give a little bit more context to the stakeholders. So I would join their guilds, their stand-ups, any of those meetings that they would group, and try to just tell them the real life example that happened for big companies. So I've mentioned around the secret management, we all know that pushing keys, credentials on GitHub is a pretty bad thing. So developers know that, but giving a real life example, like what happened 3-4 years ago at the Uber group, because one of their engineers actually pushed credentials, and we all know that they're linked to a data breach for them. So giving those real life example can give them a little bit more context. Another one is we love to have acronyms and security jargon. Unfortunately, it's also good not only to throw, like, for example, if I throw it to CSP or SRI, you'll look at me as like, oh, that's great, Sonia. What is it? Even if I told you content security policy or resource integrity, you'll say, yeah, still it doesn't make any sense. But if you start telling a story that 3-4 years ago, a lot of governmental websites had crypto miner on their website, which was ConeHive. It actually was an accessibility tool called BrowserLoud that was tampered with this crypto miner. And so it was using the browser of the other user to just mine on their Bitcoin or whatever they were using. So giving those kind of examples will give more context to developers, because they will understand. And also, if you have your PO and PM in those meetings, they will also understand that the end user, for example, for this crypto miner, will actually slow down the website. So there's an impact on the revenue. So it could actually push more your security message that you want to convey to the developers. So that's one thing. Just try to join the forum where your engineers are. Another thing that I'm trying to do at Pride is to try what we call chat ops. So basically, it's we're using Slack as a messaging platform, and to have all the tools that we're using, so all the tools that I mentioned previously with Snyk, the Pentabot, GitHub, integrated on Slack through webhooks or any native integration that they have with Slack. I think you can also do with Chime and other messaging tool if they have those kind of integration. But it's also good to have that monitoring source. Will you have the relevant stakeholder in one channel instead of having in different platforms? And once you have that alert, you can start investigating and having the discussion with your engineers. So yeah, also chat ops is something that we're having a look at Pride.
That's great. I'm a big believer in integrating those tools and making it easier for developers to kind of get the information they need as they're going through their workflows. Alyssa, have you seen any workflows or techniques that have really worked to get developers more engaged?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is, as security people, we got to think different, right? And that's something that frustrates me right now as a security community. I can't tell you how many talks I've gone to on DevSecOps and how to get security in DevOps, and they talk in the same way that we've thought about security for as long as I've been in the industry, and that is, security is a gate between phases. So you have your coding phase, and then you have this security gate of maybe you run a static analysis tool before it goes into test phase, and then in test phase, when you get done with that, you run a dynamic analysis tool before it goes to the next level. And that breaks DevOps, right? I mean, because you've got this long feedback cycle, and at the end of which you might actually push the pipeline backward because you're going to fail a build, or you're going to, fail it in test, and you're going to create all these new backlog items. And so what kind of bringing together what Sonia and Jujhar talked about is you need to bring this stuff to developers. And we've heard this term before, frictionlessly, right? Do frictionless enable your developers to be a part of the security solution, but it's got to be frictionless. So some of that's tooling. Some of it is just having those tools that integrate and meet them where they live. Things that integrate into their existing repos or into their IDEs, that they don't have to run a separate process. They don't have to learn a new tool or learn a new thing. They can just, it's already there, and it speaks to them in the language. And this is to Jujar's point. It speaks to them in a language they already understand. And this is one of the things when I talk threat modeling that I stress so much, and I stress it when I talk about this user story-based threat modeling, is have your business people do that. The people who are writing the user stories, who understand it from a plain language context, have them write the threat model. Forget about Stride and all those frameworks that were in that book from Adam Shostak, which I love. Adam, thank you, Adam. That book is great. But get rid of some of those frameworks. Developers don't need to know, business people don't need to know if it's spoofing or repudiation. It doesn't matter, right? Just tell me in plain language, there's a risk that someone might DDoS us because they're upset about things we said about the current president of the United States. And so I think that those are the things that we really need to be focused on. I know it's kind of higher level, but at a conceptual level, that's what we need. Make it so it's easy to understand. This is why secure code awareness training always fails, because devs go to this and it's security people trying to ram security terminology into devs' heads. No, they got enough stuff to deal with. Bring it to their language. And that's what is incumbent on security people to do. Is we're the experts in security. We need to be able to communicate that in language that other people understand, not expect them to understand our language.
So if I just add to that, I mean, so I'm a DevOps, like 10 plus years of cloud and DevOps and infrastructure engineering. So I've only been in the security sphere for about a year and a half. So there's all the security stuff. So not a season pro like Alyssa, but it's kind of, and Sonia, it's new to me. And so I still think like a software engineer. So that's been hugely, because I'll jump in and I'll pair with engineers, and then and that's been hugely useful. And I've done like a secure code type tooling, and it's super impressive. But then I'd argue, it sounds ridiculous, but I'd argue with the platform that's not idiomatic JavaScript. You don't write it like that. That's not, and it lost my respect, even though from a security perspective, they absolutely knew what they were talking about. But from a code perspective, oh, that's not right. I'd never write that kind of code in a million years. And there's that disconnect, which I'm still trying to figure out, how to bridge the two worlds, because security really, just like DevOps, is all about culture. It's not about tools. It's not about technology. It's culture, and culture is what's going to make you secure. And I feel that sometimes we get too distracted by and I'm guilty of this, distracted by the technology, distracted by the terminology, and come back to it. How do we change the culture? How do we influence the culture? How do we move that cultural needle?
Somewhere Patrick Dubois right now is dancing because he said DevOps is about culture. And yeah, that is so crucial.
It is. And I think your point about having a common language, Alyssa, is really important as well. And let's talk about kind of the most common language, which is metrics. And Alyssa, I know you're very data driven and you're a researcher at heart. Can you, and I know you're also working on a new report coming out pretty soon. Can you give us an early preview or tell us what's going to go into it?
Yeah, so it's not really a report, it's a white paper, but it's based on, I sat down and I really wanted to look at how do we really know if we're doing well in our DevOps pipeline from a security perspective in particular. And I mean, a million people have talked about security metrics and what you should gather and whatever, but we still never seem to really get there. It always seems to be kind of nebulous because we're talking about things in terms of what didn't happen, right? So how do you make that case for a negative occurrence? But, so I started looking at metrics, and one of the things that I've noticed with metrics and the way people look at them to measure they're usually based on vulnerabilities, which is fine. We're talking vulnerability management in this case. So that makes some sense. But we tend to look at metrics in two ways that I think are wrong. First, we tend to set targets that are very arbitrary, right? So I'll look at this, I'll say, oh, I've got, this many high vulnerabilities. I want to have that I'm down to this many, or I fix this many high severity vulnerabilities each month, or my vulnerabilities are fixed in this time frame. Well, that's not really meaningful, right? That's just numbers, and it sets you for like this hard attainment, rather than making sure what you really need to be focused on is just that you're getting better over time. I call it the other CI, right? We've got continuous integration, continuous development, or deployment. I say you need continuous improvement. And that's got to be your goal for security. It's not about we're going to secure everything under the sun and we're going to be great. It's how do we focus on continuous improvement? And so setting these arbitrary targets that we're just going to try to hit, they don't get us to that. They get us to, here's this hard arbitrary number, we got to hit it. And so, I wanted to move away from that. And the other thing I wanted to do that I noticed happens with security metrics is they get assessed in a vacuum. So I say, I'm going to look at how many high severity vulnerabilities I got. And if I have too many, that's bad. And I'm going to look at how long my remediations take. And if that's too long, it's bad. Well, how do those things start to factor together? Like if I had a high severity vulnerability that, say it was in a dependency and that dependency didn't have a fix available, so I had to create something myself. That's going to affect how long it takes for my remediation. But the fact that I remediated that doesn't matter that it took long. It's a good thing. So in that case, a longer remediation time frame that skews that metric. If I'm only looking at that one metric, it doesn't tell me anything. I need to be looking at how many of my vulnerabilities had immediate fixes available versus had to have code written. How many of my vulnerabilities were high versus low? One of the things I looked at, and this is a really cool theme, I just looking through scan results from Snyk and did some trend analysis. And what I found is that the more vulnerabilities a package has, the higher the percentage that they are low or medium severity versus high. So in other words, the more vulnerabilities you find, the lower severity they tend to be. The fewer vulnerabilities that a package had, the more often they actually tended to be high severity. So if you don't take that into account when you're looking at, well, how many open vulnerabilities do I have? Or what percentage of my vulnerabilities are high severity versus low? Those are all things that can, you need to understand that greater picture. So the white paper that I'm putting together then is a metrics model that is based on those interrelations, and then builds just kind of a tangible score, right? Because you still want something objective at the end of the day, but with the goal of measuring that score, not that, hey, we want to attain 6 or we want to get to 7. It's, hey, can we use this to measure that we got better this last month over the month before, or we implemented this new practice or this new tool. How did that improve or not improve where we were in terms of that maturity?
That sounds like a super useful framework, Alyssa, and I can't wait for that to come out. Jujhar, Sonia, any thoughts on metrics, or what have you seen work really well?
I'm waiting for Alyssa's white paper because whatever I've got planned is going to be wrong. It's take lots of experimentation. The important thing for me is not to get distracted. We have limited engineering capacity. Right, both in terms of with the teams, their backlog, they've got features to deliver, and then they've also got to pay down this technical debt, and then sort of the security team, which uses within the economists, we use the enablement model, so they jump into teams and cut code. There's only a handful of us, and everyone else is super busy. So to be able to get the metrics right and be able to target the high value targets, right? And get those done first. So to be able to prioritize what gets done, and to be able to then accept, okay, these are a map. I go to my boss, I say, these are all the lower ones. We've done all these ones. These ones are still, they're still there if you want it. sorted. We need more capacity to do that. I haven't got it right, so I'm absolutely waiting for Alyssa's white paper, and I'm just going to hopefully just copy paste and just use that, right? Because again, like I said, I'm not an expert, so to be able to just say, okay, we're going to take this framework, we're going to apply it. It's going to be super useful.
How about you, Sonia? Any metrics? Last thoughts on metrics?
Yeah, I'm also a great advocate on continuous improvements. What we've been doing at Prime London on the README file, I've been adding all the badges from all the tools, so we have some sort of metrics. And obviously, when you start implementing those tools, you'll be in the red-ish area. But then it's really great to see, once we improve the code base, to see those colors changing to something more greenish. It's always great, and also it gives a good visibility of the health of the project. So yeah, I'd say, yeah, having those badges on the README file also is a good indicator for the open source community on the effort and the continuous improvement that you're doing using the different tools. So yeah, this is one way to check the metrics on the open source. But yeah, continuous improvement, yeah, just waiting for the white paper as well.
I'm going to say I love that idea of the badges too, because we've struggled in open source for how long with trying to actually measure package health. That, God, if we could get open source maintainers to kind of adopt that would go such a long way in helping with that.
It sounds like we need to have a follow-up once your white paper is out, Alyssa. Get the band back together.
My go-to-market strategy here a little bit on this white paper after this conversation.
Well, it sounds super useful. Any last thoughts or anything that our panelists would like to share with the audience? Something you're working on, how to connect with you, anything like that? What you're excited about? That's a good one.
Well,
I'm excited about the new Apple M1 processors. I don't like Apple but I have to, hats off to them. They've done an amazing engineering job, and hopefully we can get something.
I like it if they can figure out why Docker isn't working on it right now.
I know, right? Well, they've got to get Golang working first. but I said that in jest, but really, I just want to contextualize. I mean, we're saying open source vulnerabilities, and what I've noticed is certainly among the C level, with my execs, I've been using that term a lot, but the impression it gives is that open source is inherently insecure. But actually, I would argue that open source is, and hopefully Alyssa could speak to this, but is more secure. We do not have any visibility on closed source. So we're having this conversation about open source and open source vulnerabilities and security because we can. We can't even have these conversations about, so, that we call it the Rumsfeld index, which is the unknown unknowns. Within my CISO came up with that, not me. And it sounds like we're bashing on open source, but we absolutely love open source. I'm sure all of us do, right? And we want to encourage that. We just always contextualize it. I think, and I don't know, but I think closed source has more vulnerabilities, and we have no way of closing that. So we should be using more and more open source, which is why even Apple have got amazing processors. It's going to become closed source, right? We need to avoid that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the key with open source to me is just understanding the difference in the threats and what we have to do. Closed source, yeah, you have no visibility into it. You don't know it's there. Open source is great. But of course, you have the challenge of that dependency tree that Sonia was talking about before, right? And it's, okay, when new version or new vulnerabilities are announced, how do I find out if I have that version of, to use everybody's favorite example from Equifax, if I got that vulnerable version of struts? Well, no, I don't see it anywhere in my code. It's not in any of my manifests, so I'm okay. And then 2 months later, you get exploited. Why? Because that dependency that you had a dependency which brought in struts and had the vulnerable version in it. And, so I mean, I think that's the challenge with open source versus, the unknown in closed sources. You are counting on that vendor you got that software from, that they've taken the necessary steps to secure it, and that they're doing all they need to do around open source. So yeah, the open source world, what's exciting me right now is that there's a lot of research being done. there's a lot of universities are building labs and having graduate and postgraduate students doing daily research in the open source community, looking for certain types of vulnerabilities and creating tooling that can find it. And that to me is super exciting. We get a lot of the vulnerability reports that we get and we register CVEs for come from researchers who are working in those labs. And then on top of it, of course, you have your independent researchers, and you have commercial companies like ours that are out there doing it too. And so that is truly exciting about open source, is that we're seeing that much effort going into trying to secure that ecosystem.
Great. And Sonia, any last thoughts or things you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, if we have, this is really shamelessly, but if we have any women in the audience, I'm working on that initiative called Epic Women in Tech and Epic Women in Cyber. So if you're part of it, I'd really love to have an interview with you. The amazing Alison Mailer was one of them. So yeah, it would be great just to have more visibility and just more inclusion and diversity into tech. It has nothing to do with DevSecOps, but yeah.
I argue it has everything to do with DevSecOps. Everything to do with it. Until society is equal and fair, we shouldn't rest. So it has everything to do with it. Yeah.
That's a fantastic call out. Thank you so much. And I just want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and experience. I hope we can do this again sometime, maybe once your report launches. All right, everyone. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.